Hello, my friend, and welcome to day one of Painting the Wilderness Light. Over the next 5 days, we're going to use watercolor to explore the magic of light throughout the day. First up, night. We are using watercolor to explore a more muted and dark color palette, and as you can imagine, most of the time when you see light at night, it's not, blindingly throughout the sky. It's really subtle and in shimmers that reflect starlight or moonlight via water or anything else that might reflect any kind of light. So when we're painting night and trying to capture light at nighttime, it's all about the subtle contrasts. So as you're painting along with me, remember that even if you don't have the colors that I'm using, even if you don't have the supplies that I'm using, you can still create a really beautiful, meaningful experience for you. Let's dive into this nighttime scene. The first thing that we're going to do is open our sketchbook. This is a handmade sketchbook I have that's filled with arches, 100% cotton, cold press paper, and I am going to tape off all of the edges. When I tape off edges, I always start top to bottom. So I do the top and then the bottom, and then I do side to side. And the reason I do the tape in parallel lines like that, as opposed to going like all the way around in order, is so that the adhesive side of the tape doesn't get stuck on each other. So tape is just easier to take off that way. So we taped off all of the edges, and I put binder clips on just in case to kind of keep everything taut. And before we start painting, I'm gonna do a quick little sketch of the scene. So all of the sketch part, I'm gonna try to keep in the bottom third of the painting. I want the sky to take up about 2/3 and the sketch to take up about 1/3 at the bottom. So I'm gonna do a horizontal line like a quarter of the way up, and that's where the lake is gonna be, and then two chunks of mountain coming out from either side. So it's kind of like a rough, kind of choppy triangle coming out from either side of the page, and then just a little hill, kind of far away mountain in between those two that I have. So we have 3 mountain layers. The 2 front ones are bigger, and the back one that's kind of in between are smaller. And this whole scene is the mountains are taking up about 1/3 of the bottom. Okay, so now that we have the sketch, let's work on the sky. First, I got the whole page wet with clean water, and now I'm going to make a gradient, which is a subtle shift in color from one color to the next, using the wet on wet technique. So this dark blue that I'm using is Winsor & Newton Indigo, and I took a bunch of indigo and I started from the top, and I'm slowly in side to side strokes moving down toward the bottom. And then just before I hit the mountain, I want to lift up because I don't want the indigo to hit the mountains. I want there to be some light white space just above the mountains. And that's one of the reasons why we use the wet on wet technique. So then I'm going to do the same thing kind of in reverse for the lake. I want the bottom of the lake, and this is the wet on wet technique, right? I want the bottom of the lake to be darker blue and then slowly get lighter, because the top of the lake is where there's going to be fog. So we're using white space to create mist and to create fog. That's part of the light that we're practicing, right? So this is just the first layer, and to kind of summarize, we just made a gradient where we got the whole page wet first, so we could use the wet on wet technique so that the paint is really blurry and it blends really well. And then and then we used Winsor & Newton Indigo, and we started at the top, so the top is darker and it gradually gets lighter. And one way to make sure that your gradient kind of stays that way, where to make sure the paint doesn't go down to the mountains, is to lift up before you get to the mountains, clean off your brush, and then brush upward. So you might have saw me do that a few minutes ago, but that's a really effective way when you're trying to maintain a smooth gradient, is to paint downward first and then clean off your brush and use clean water to paint upward. So we have that first layer down. I used a heat tool to dry it, and then I re-wet my layer with clean water. So this is a brand new layer. I dried the first one, and then I re-wet this layer with clean water. And I added a little bit of Quinacridone Rose to Indigo to make it these different shades of violet. So I don't want the whole sky to be this violet color, which is, again, indigo mixed with quinacridone rose, which is like a magenta color. But I do want little peaks of violet, really watery, like light value violet, basically toward the mountain. So I started by using the wet on wet technique, dropping in some just casual strokes of violet, and then I'm going to go back with darker indigo. So there's like a lot of paint on my brush here. With darker indigo, start painting at the top, so the darkest part of the paint stays at the top. And then I'm using really choppy strokes, kind of back and forth, to add more violet and then add more indigo on top of the violet, so that I have these peaks of violet coming through the indigo, right? And this can be super messy. The whole point isn't to make it look like mine. The whole point is to just have, near the bottom where the mountains are, to have tiny little stripes of violet peeking through the indigo. So we want most of this to look blue, right? We just want the bottom part to look lighter blue and have that little bit of violet peeking out. So then once you have this layer all the way done, take some white gouache. While it's still wet, take some white gouache with your size 2 brush and just splatter it on top of this wet layer. And we're gonna splatter on top of the wet layer before we dry it, because I find that when you have 2 layers of stars, it works out, it kind of gives a little more depth to the scene. So the way that you splatter is by putting a little bit of water in your white gouache to activate it, but then holding your paintbrush over the area that you want to splatter, and use one finger or lots of fingers, like really forcefully, and like really smack the paintbrush. If you just tap it, it's probably not going to work. If you want to use a bigger paintbrush, you can. That will get you more splatters, but it could also get you larger splatters, and those don't always look like stars. Some people also use like a spare toothbrush to get splatters that way. I still like to use a small paintbrush like I'm doing, because I find it just helps me to control the splatters a little bit more. So if that is the first layer of the night sky. We had a gradient in 2 different layers, right? And so it's darkest at the top, and then it gradually gets lighter in those kind of like back-to-back strokes. And then we let that whole layer dry, and now we're starting on the mountains. So I'm using indigo with a little bit of that quinacridone rose, so I get this kind of blue-violet color, and I'm using a lot of water when I paint the mountain. And I'm painting just a whole layer all the way across, kind of like with a craggy mountain ridge, but I'm very intentionally using paint for the ridge and then water to bring down the paint and keep that little line between the lake and the mountain white. So I want there to be some space between the lake and the mountain. I want that to stay like light. It doesn't have to be bright white, but I want it to be lighter than the rest of everything, because that's where the mist is going to go. And if you find your paint kind of veering into the light space and you're not sure how to preserve it, use clean water and brush upward. So like push the paint away, brush upward into the mountain. You can also use what's called a thirsty brush, which is a clean brush that you have blotted off on a damp towel, and kind of lift up the paint that way. I'm going to show you again what a thirsty brush looks like when we create the waterfall. So this mountain was basically kind of like a guideline for the layers of mountains that we're going to have. And now I'm going to paint one of the more foreground mountains. So I'm still using indigo with a little bit of that quinacridone rose, so it's like this blue-violet color. And I'm starting to paint this mountain from the side, but then I'm washing off my brush and using water to bring the paint down and to kind of feather it down into the bottom. Because again, I want to keep that part white, right? I want to preserve the white space as much as possible. And because I'm working on this while the mountain layer is wet, I can kind of use my paintbrush to create a wet, outline of the mountain, and then tap in darker paint toward the top of the mountain, but then immediately wash off my brush so that I still preserve the white space. I can bring the mountain down, but still preserve the white space. Now I'm using a thirsty brush on that wet mountain ridge. So again, a thirsty brush is a clean, damp brush, and I'm just pressing down onto the mountain and lifting up. And that's going to lift the paint in the shape of this waterfall that I want. So it's really just kind of like a curved line, right? A little curved line where the waterfall is going to go. Now, don't worry, you don't have to have, that doesn't have to be the only part of the waterfall. I'm also gonna use white gouache to show you what that looks like. But once we have that mountain layer down, I'm going to dry it with a dryer or let it dry naturally. And then I'm going to paint the very foreground mountain layer. This will be the darkest. So if you want to remember anything about distance, trying to create depth, especially with mountain layers, the darkest layers are going to be at the top. They're going to be bigger, and the lightest layers will be in the back. So light layers means it's farther away. Dark layers means it's closer. So we're doing this mountain the same way that we did the other one, right? Where we're starting with dark paint, but then using a clean brush to brush the bottom up, right? We're starting from the bottom of the mountain up and using water to let the paint to preserve the white space. So we still have that line of mist. And then I'm using a thirsty brush to kind of like lift some lighter spaces in the mountain to kind of give the mountain a little bit of texture. This is a night scene, remember? So in order to see texture, we want to see some of the stars, some of the moonlight reflecting off of the lighter areas. And so the only really light areas we're going to see is where we can see some of those reflections. And so that's why I'm using a thirsty brush to kind of lift some light areas in that mountain. And now for that back mountain, I put in I use a tiny bit of darker paint to kind of create some texture on that back mountain too. That's optional, you don't have to do that. So once we've got the mountains done, now we're trying to make the lake a little bit darker. We want the bottom of the lake to look so super dark. So we're basically doing the same thing that we did with that first layer, right? Getting it wet, just up to the mountain, just up to the bottom of the mountains, and then gradually lifting up. But then once we get to that light layer of mist, I'm using a clean brush to preserve that misty area, right? So I'm using a clean, wet brush to kind of smooth out the gradient, to smooth out the edges, while also lifting paint away if I need to, pushing paint away so that I can keep that white area white, or at least if it's not white, keep it lighter than everything else. That's more important than anything, is to keep that little strip of space between the lake and the mountains, to keep it lighter than anything else. So I let that dry, and now you don't have to do this, but I'm going to use white gouache to kind of just make a little bit brighter highlights where the waterfall is, and some of where the water is, like in that misty area. So I just did like a little slight curve where the waterfall is, right? Using my white gouache, I just painted a little slight curve where the waterfall is. And then I'm kind of using the dry brush technique just under the waterfall and a little bit off to the side to add a little bit more shimmers there. And then I'm gonna use a clean, wet brush. So I cleaned off my size 2 brush, and I'm just gonna kind of reactivate gouache. So gouache is very similar to watercolor, except you can reactivate it with water, and it's because it has a little bit of chalk in it typically. And so when you paint with white gouache, you can soften it by painting it like dry, like those dry brush strokes that I did, but then using clean water right on top of it to kind of soften the edges and blend it in with the scene a little bit. And so that's a really great way to use white gouache to create mist in case, when you were trying to preserve your light space, maybe it kind of got away from you. And that's it. After we paint the waterfall with the gouache, that's the whole scene. So to kind of sum up the layers that we did, right? We did that first base, we did the sketch first, and then we did a base layer where we kind of laid the foundation for the gradient that we want. So it's dark at the top and then gradually gets lighter toward the mountains, dark at the bottom, and we kept that strip of white space. And then we added a little bit of violet toward the back of the mountains and just kind of created a textured wash there. And then we splattered some stars on the wet gradient and let that dry, and then splattered more stars on the dry sky. So we have lots of stars lighting up the sky. Then we did 3 mountain layers, but we kind of painted the 3 mountain layers all in one silhouette first, and then gradually painted more mountain layers on top of each other, going from light to dark. And we want to keep these mountain layers different, right? So each of the mountain layers look different. They're different shapes. Variety is going to make your scene look more natural, make it look more realistic. So you want the mountain layers to have really craggy ridges, and you want each of the mountain layers to look different. So after we painted the mountain layers, especially with the foreground mountain layers, we made sure to maintain that white space, right? By using clean water on your paintbrush to kind of paint at the bottom of the mountain layers upward. So it pushed the paint up into the mountain layer and preserved some of the white space, which created this misty effect. And after we painted the mountains, we used a thirsty brush on that far right mountain to lift some of the paint in the shape of a waterfall. And then we let that dry, painted another layer of the lake with the gradient, and then finished off the waterfall with some white gouache. So now it's the loved and learned portion of this painting, which is where you think about everything you loved about the painting. So that could be a result that you got, or it could be a moment that you had. One of my favorite things about this painting is the gradual gradient in the sky. I love how it gets lighter toward the back. And then what you learned. So one of the things you could have learned is you can reactivate white gouache to kind of give it that misty effect that maybe you missed when you were trying to preserve the white space, right? Or a thirsty brush. Maybe you didn't know what a thirsty brush was, which is a clean, damp brush that you can use to lift paint from a wet wash. Maybe you also learned that, you don't like using gouache, or you like some things more than others. The whole point of this is not so that you can, find all of your quote mistakes. It's really to discover what you love about creating. So think about what you loved about the piece, parts of the process that you loved, and think about what you learned about yourself and what you learned about watercolor. All right, that about sums up day 1. I hope you had such a great time. I know I did, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.